So today, it's a lot going on. Particularly, there's been a lot going on where I'm from, on the south side of Chicago. And more recently, the news broke about a young cop that was killed in the line of duty, pursuing a suspect. And this happened on 82nd and Drexel, right by Cottage Grove, for those who know. This is an area where it's cracking. This is one of those spots on the south side where it's definitely going down. It was reported that a young cop was pursuing a suspect into one of the buildings on 82nd and Drexel. However the story went, the result was the young cop was killed, a young woman officer. And then once the call went out that this happened, the police swarmed that block. They was deep as hell on that block instantly, as you would expect them to be. So initially, as the news broke, people automatically assumed that it was the suspect responsible for this cop's death, which in turn, why the police presence was so heavy in the neighborhood directly after. They had the streets blocked off. They was checking everything that was moving in that direction. It was a state of emergency as far as the police was concerned. Now, I don't know if we got the rest of the story later that night or the next day, because to me, even that matters. And it's important because it was discovered that the young cop was actually shot by a fellow officer and not the suspect. Now, again, I don't remember how long it took for the police to make the correct statement to the public, because I thought that was kind of weird that the story was breaking on the news and social media, but all the facts weren't clear, to the point that we'll make it seem as if they didn't know that information when the news broke. Why would this type of story get to the media to be released to the world without the police actually knowing what really happened? Now, first, I want to say condolences to that police officer and her family. When we have these conversations, a lot of times it's not to highlight a certain person, but it's to put a scope on a bigger picture. So then let's get back to the main story now. This young cop was pursuing a suspect and she was shot and killed by a fellow officer. Again, I'm not lost on basic human concepts. Mistakes happen. Sure, we're talking about life and death. We're not talking about paperwork being filed the wrong way or a code of conduct, a violation. We talking about somebody's life. Cops are oftentimes reckless, but with the most important thing, human life. These are not just small errors and mistakes. These critical oversights and missteps are costing people their lives. So much so that when the news first broke, it was on that night, as if the cop was killed by a random suspect. The reaction with the actual law enforcement suggests that this cop was killed by a suspect. Because if it was known that it was by a fellow officer, why would they need to respond to that scene like that? I don't know shit about being 12, but I know they always on that radio. They always on that radio for every small detail, for every detail. How can they get on that radio and not be the thing that's being dispatched? Is that it's an officer down and then whatever the code is for friendly fire. Because like I say, I'm not 12, so I don't know the playbook, but I know that this play exists, that they have to dispatch what's happening over the radio, especially so dispatch can know if they have to send a certain amount of backup, to which whoever this dispatch person was seemed to have sent half the force to 82nd and Drexel. The reports are that there were no other shell casings found, meaning that no other weapon was discharged. Where did this suggest that the suspect was even armed? So when I say overzealous, anxious, and reckless, this is a part of it. And then when I talk about basic human nature of being in environments like this, of course you're going to be on the defensive. Of course you're going to be fully aware. That's a human trait. It's instinct. It don't matter if you got a badge or not. So why does that keep being a valid excuse for cops to just discharge their weapon at the first sign of trouble? They're running into a building. What if that just happened to be somebody in the building that's hearing noise and trying to see what's going on? What if that was just a civilian? It happened to be one of their own. It happened to be a fellow officer though, because back to the neighborhood being swarmed and cut off and blocked, if it had just been a civilian or the suspect, it wouldn't have been that much of a police presence on 82nd and Drexel that day. These people swarmed this neighborhood as if a suspect shot this cop. Law enforcement in Chicago, CPD, acted as if they were about to go to war, and it was their own doing. And somehow, the initial dispatch didn't convey that information for whatever reason. Okay, so again, overly anxious, overzealous, and reckless. The last time I checked, police officers wore uniforms. How can you even mistake a cop for somebody else in such a small space? The details always matter. The devil is in the detail. They are around 82nd and Drexel. These are all apartment buildings, multi-unit buildings. There's not that much space for confusion. The hallways, very narrow. Staircase, even more narrow. There's not like corners and places where you could just lose track of the people that you entered the building with, or just lose track of people that are dressed like you. But because it was a fellow cop, we're about to ignore the fact that this was murder. The only time that we're not going to ignore that it was murder is when we talk about the suspect that they caught, which would be another part of our discussion soon. But for right now, as far as the officer that discharged his weapon, it's not looked at as a murder, or at least I haven't heard it referred to as that. I'm not here to really get into the semantics of that actual event, but at the same time, I'm not about to ignore the obvious either, because we hear all of these news stories from the media, but it's weird that we never hear these type of intricate details. The PR of this situation will make it seem as though the opposite of what I'm saying, as if this was some type of apartment building that it would have been easy to get lost in the shuffle. But I'm here to tell you, as somebody that's lived on the South Side my whole life and that knows these neighborhoods and these areas, that's not that building. I'm finding it hard to believe you couldn't identify one of your own in that building that's wearing the entire police uniform. But that's just food for thought. The universe will deal with that, even if law enforcement doesn't. That's always my thing. The universe will always correct any wrongdoings. It don't matter what we talking about at the end of the day. We only could get away with so much, because at the end of the day, God got the last say so. So with that being said, let's talk about the suspect in question. And that now it's been reported that he will face charges in connection with that murder. Now, I haven't followed the reports extensively to know the exact literature and the exact charges that this suspect will be receiving. But I'm pretty sure somehow they're going to have some charge of murder associated with this suspect's charges. And I guess to a lot of people, that's fitting. I guess to people that know better than me, that's what's supposed to happen. If there was no reports of this suspect having a weapon, brandishing a weapon, or discharging a weapon, why should that suspect be charged with murder? Because the police officers made a mistake. I'm not saying that the suspect shouldn't face charges if he did something illegal. Then charge him with the things he's guilty of doing. But just in my opinion, I guess, I don't see how a murder charge can be thrown on this suspect if he wasn't a direct threat to that officer or any other officer that was on the scene that day. I'm pretty sure it's all type of literature and codes and laws that say otherwise from what I'm saying. I'm pretty sure. But that doesn't mean that it's the right thing. We get caught up too much on what the law is, and we'll forget that my culture and my community used to have a lot of laws that was directly against our safety and well-being and freedom. So am I free to not give a about all laws? Am I free to not care at all about some laws? Because there used to be several laws that was set up and designed to make my culture and my community be less than a human being. And some could argue the fact that some of those laws still exist in certain ways. Regardless of all of that, let's bring it back to this situation with this young cop being killed by a fellow officer pursuing a suspect. I'm pretty sure this suspect is going to be charged with murder somehow. It's all of these nuanced codes and pieces of literature to define what the laws are and what a murder is. And I'm pretty sure one of those categories of murder is going to be charged for this suspect. But if that suspect didn't directly oppose a threat to these officers, if it was no weapon, if it was no weapon flashed, and damn sure if it wasn't no weapon fired, how are we even talking about murder for the suspect? If he's guilty of other things, then yes, charge him with that. But law enforcement or whoever is willing to throw a murder charge on this suspect when the police officer was the one that committed the murder, regardless if it was intentional or not, because it still speaks to a bigger point. A life was lost. And why? We can't just be lazy and irresponsible and say that it's because this suspect ran away from the police. We can't say that that's the definitive reason why this young cop had to lose her life. It's because a young man ran from the police. No, it's a much bigger issue at hand. Some of this law enforcement is too scary to do this job effectively. It's just no other way to say it. This is not the show where I have all of these sophisticated ways of trying to prove my point. This not Channel 7 News. This not MSNBC. It's not CNN. I'm Southside Trey. We do things a little bit differently over here. And hopefully way more effective, because it's time for all of us to start thinking a little bit more clearly and looking a little bit more closely at things that's really going on. We already know the cop isn't going to be charged with anything, but I do wonder what's next. What's the next step for this cop? Does he go to detention for 6 months and then he back out in the field? Like, I'm really asking, what's the protocol next? Because to me, once more, that's a whole bigger problem. I don't see how that could just be brushed off in 6 months, even a year. I can't see how that's brushed off in even a year's time, and this cop is able to go back on active duty.